When I was in college, there was a rumor going around about a strange man making deals in an old biker bar. People claimed he was offering something special, something more valuable than anything you could buy or sell. I didn't think much of it at first. Just a ghost story passed around over drinks and late nights. But the more I heard, the more curious I got. Eventually, I couldn't get it out of my head. I knew the old stories, Faust selling his soul, Midas and his golden touch. But I wasn't going in blindly. I thought maybe if he was real, I could make a deal of my own without any of those unintended consequences. That's how I found myself standing outside a rundown biker bar called Elysium one cold, rainy October night. The place was exactly what you'd expect. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and stale beer, and the hum of conversations grew as I stepped inside. It was packed with regulars, older bikers with grizzled beards, younger ones in matching leather jackets, all of them with that look that told you they weren't the type to mess with. I took it all in, scanning the room for anyone who looked out of place. Then I saw him. He was lounging in a dark corner booth, alone, his feet propped up on the table. He looked out of place in a way I can't entirely explain. Maybe it was his pale, almost corpse-like skin, or the way he seemed so at ease, like he'd been waiting for me. He wore a long white leather duster over an old Metallica t-shirt with Lady Justice emblazoned on it, a chain of black metal hanging from his belt, and black riding boots with silver buckles. His eyes were closed, and for a second I thought he might be asleep. Taking a deep breath, I walked over to his booth and stood there, waiting. I wasn't sure what I expected him to do, but he didn't even twitch. "Excuse me, sir," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, trying not to sound too nervous. Slowly, he opened his eyes, icy blue and piercing, and took a slow sip of his whiskey before giving me a half smile. "Aren't you gonna sit down?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper, as he motioned to the seat across from him. I hesitated, feeling my throat tighten, but I didn't want to show fear. "It's rude to sit without permission," I replied, doing my best to sound calm. "Would you like some company, sir?" For a moment he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then, out of nowhere, he started chuckling softly, almost like he'd forgotten what it felt like to laugh. It wasn't sinister or menacing, just unexpected. "Now that is funny," he said, finally removing his feet from the table and gesturing for me to sit down. I took my seat, carefully placing my hands in my lap to hide that they were shaking. I knew better than to act like prey in front of a predator. After a moment, I worked up the courage to ask, "What's funny, if I may ask?" He grinned, an amused look in his eyes. "You, kid. You're young, barely into your 20s, but you have respect, manners. People barge in here all the time, demanding things, accusing me of being a fraud. But you came in here and asked nicely." He picked up the whiskey bottle and poured a shot for each of us, sliding one my way. I didn't want to drink it, but after he'd complimented my manners, I felt like refusing would be rude. I raised the glass, nodded my thanks, and downed the shot. The whiskey burned on the way down, but it had a warmth that was almost comforting on a cold night like this. "Thank you, sir. It's most appreciated," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's drop the formalities," he replied, waving a hand. "You can call me Mortimer." I opened my mouth to reply, but he held up his hand, cutting me off. "No need to introduce yourself, Tony," he said, looking at me with that same amused expression. "Anthony, short for Thomas Anthony, although you can't stand the Thomas part. Family tradition, I know. You would have preferred Atticus, after your great-great-great-grandfather." Hearing him recite these intimate details felt like having my soul laid bare. I hadn't even told anyone about my dislike for my first name, let alone the part about Atticus. The words escaped my mouth before I could stop them. "How did you know that?" Mortimer leaned back, crossing his arms. "Kid, you know who they say I am, don't you?" A chill ran down my spine, and all I could do was nod. "If I'm really the Reaper, Thanatos, or Death himself, wouldn't I know?" He reached down, pulling a heavy black book from his side, chained to his belt. He flipped it open, finding my name effortlessly, my date of birth listed beside it, and a blank spot just to the right. He shut the book quickly, a knowing smile on his face. "No reading ahead now," he said with a smirk. "Wouldn't want you trying to change anything." The book shrank down, fitting back into his pocket. I was frozen in place, part of me wanting to run, but another part was too intrigued to leave. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to remember why I'd come here. "Mortimer," I said, steadying my voice. "I came to make a bargain." Mortimer chuckled again, taking his time to savor another sip of whiskey before responding. "All right, Tony. What is it you desire? Wealth? Love? Power?" With each word, his tone grew colder, more dismissive, as if granting such wishes were trivial and beneath him. Before I could answer, he held up a hand. "Wait. I already know. You want knowledge." He was right. Ever since I was a kid, I'd always wanted to understand the world and the people in it. The more I saw of life, the more questions I had. Why are people so self-destructive? Why do we hurt each other over things that barely matter? "You realize this is the most dangerous thing you could ask for, don't you?" he said, his tone grave. "I could give you wealth, and you'd enjoy it for 20 years. I could grant you love and take only a decade off your life. But you? You want something far worse." "Please," I insisted, meeting his eyes. "Just make the deal. I need to know why things are the way they are. Name your price." Mortimer sighed, giving me a look that was almost sympathetic. "If you're truly sure, I'll grant you this one request. No tricks, no fine print. But afterward, I'll give you one last request, free of charge. Think carefully." "I understand. I agree to the bargain," I replied, bracing myself. With a solemn nod, Mortimer leaned forward and placed a single finger on my forehead. At first, there was nothing. But then, my mind was overwhelmed, flooded with images, thoughts, truths I'd never even considered. I saw everything. The darkest corners of the human soul, the raw selfishness, the petty grievances that fueled wars, hatred, and cruelty. The worst part? There was no grand conspiracy, no underlying evil force corrupting the world. It was just us, our own flaws, our own greed and pride tearing everything apart. I saw all the ugliness, all the tragedy, and the pain. When Mortimer pulled his finger away, I was gasping for air, my face wet with tears I hadn't realized I'd shed. He poured me another drink, which I downed shakily, trying to recover. "Now, Tony," he said quietly. "What's your final request?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the knowledge settling in, suffocating. "Take me with you," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I don't want to be part of this world anymore." Mortimer nodded, sadness in his eyes. Without a word, he pulled out a black helmet and handed it to me. I followed him outside, the chill of the night air somehow less biting than the darkness I now carried inside. As we approached a white Harley, I let out a bitter laugh. "So, I guess the Bible got something right, huh?" I said. Mortimer raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Death rides a pale horse." He laughed softly, a real laugh, and gestured for me to hop on. As I climbed on behind him, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. In that moment, I remembered a line from one of my favorite childhood books. "He greeted death as an old friend and went with him gladly." And as we rode off into the night, I left the weight of this world behind me,